So this lecture is now an established feature of our calendar and is an opportunity to commemorate a remarkable figure, Patsy Robertson. When Patsy died, Sonny Ramphal, who was one of the Secretary Generals, but only one with whom she worked very closely, talked about the Commonwealth sky clouding over as Patsy left us. And she remains greatly missed. The Commonwealth Association is a prime example of Patsy's foresight, because drawing on her United Nations experience, she felt there was a gap in the Commonwealth architecture insofar as there was nothing for former staff of either the official Commonwealth organisations or of other Commonwealth organisations, and therefore the opportunity to use that font of that ability to draw upon the skills and the experience of former staff. And so we are a living proof of Patsy's dedication to that cause. Now, I'm not going to say more about Patsy, but I'm going to invite Chief Emeka Anyoko, our former Commonwealth Secretary General, to introduce our guest lecturer, Sir Malcolm Rifkind.
Thank you, Stuart. I'd like to begin by saluting all of you who are listening, who are my Commonwealth friends. Those of us who are BBC, and here I'm not talking about British Broadcasting Corporation, but born before computer. Those of us who are BBC especially appreciate the IT facility which has enabled this virtual meeting to take place with all of us in our distant places of location. It is clearly a matter of regret that we are not able to meet in Marlborough House. For those of us who spent many years in Marlborough House, it's an understandable nostalgic feeling that we are not there. I had myself, coming from Nigeria, where I live most of the year, looked forward to meeting physically my former colleagues in Marlborough House today at this second Patsy Robertson lecture. Patsy was a colleague and a friend of mine for over 20 years in Marlborough House. And our chairman, Stuart, had spoken about her enduring legacy to the Commonwealth. And so also was recognized by Sonny Ramphal, my predecessor in office. So I very happily commended those of our colleagues who initiated the proposal to establish this series of lectures in memory of Patsy Robertson. I must say that I am truly delighted to be introducing our lecturer, Sir Malcolm Rifkind. Sir Malcolm was not only a distinguished British Foreign Secretary, but I must say that he is one of the very few British political leaders who accord to the Commonwealth the recognition and respect that it deserves as a potent international organization. He has, to date, rendered seminal services to the Commonwealth. And if I may mention just two, Sir Malcolm was a member of the Eminent Persons Group who produced the Commonwealth Charter, the charter that was proposed at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Perth in 2011, I think it was, and was adopted the following year in December 2012, and was signed by the head of the Commonwealth, Her Majesty the Queen, on the Commonwealth Day in 2013. And more recently, Sir Malcolm chaired the committee, special committee appointed by the Vice Chancellor of the University of London to review and make recommendations on the future of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, which was down for axing. The Institute of Commonwealth Studies, which all my colleagues, all the surviving former Commonwealth Secretaries General described in our letter, joint letter to the Vice Chancellor, as the heartbeat of the intellectual relationship within the Commonwealth. I believe that Stuart Moore, David Blake, and their colleagues on the Executive Committee of the Commonwealth Association could not have made a worthier choice in inviting Sir Malcolm Rifkind to be the lecturer today. I want personally to thank you, Malcolm, for doing us the honor of agreeing to give this lecture, especially now in the aftermath of the Kigali Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. And may I have the pleasure of inviting you to speak to us now.
Emeka, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very, very much indeed for the honor of being invited to give this lecture. And thank you, Emeka, for your very kind words of introduction. Like everyone else, I am deeply disappointed we're unable to be at Marlborough House because the annual general meeting of the Commonwealth Association and the lecture, that would have been a marvelous setting for it. But you know, the climate is something we're all getting used to. Somebody once remarked that other countries have got climate, Britain has weather. And it's true, it changes not only every day, but sometimes several times a day. So we must be fortunate that this has not impacted itself too much on our deliberations. I'm also very, very, very privileged to have been invited to give the Patsy Robertson lecture. I did not have the pleasure of knowing her well, but I'm very much aware of the extraordinary reputation and justified reputation she has, and of the contribution that she made over many years to the welfare of the Commonwealth. As is known to this audience, she not only founded the Commonwealth Association meeting today, but also chaired, was its first chair. And equally important, some might say even more important, she was the spokesperson of the Commonwealth itself on behalf of the Secretary General from 1983 to 1994, 11 years in which she showed she had extraordinary and remarkable qualities. So I'm very pleased to be taking part today, and let me share with you a few thoughts on the Commonwealth as it is and perhaps as it will be over the years to come. My connection, if I can put it this way, with the Commonwealth goes back actually a very, very long time to when I was a young a student, an undergraduate at Edinburgh University. And in 1964, when it was decided to form what became known as COMEX, a Commonwealth overland expedition from the United Kingdom to India. It was the brainchild of a retired Gurkha officer called Lionel Gregory, who had known Nehru well and many of the Congress leaders. And he was not just interested in the United Kingdom-India connection. He was very passionate about introducing a new, younger generation who would not have known the origins of the Commonwealth or had no personal links with the empire. But he wanted to make sure that the Commonwealth, when it met, it was not just prime ministers and presidents and monarchs who were meeting, but it was a vast range of ordinary people, including young people. And so we were 200 British students in driving our own coaches, 5 single-decker coaches, 40 in each coach, Scotland, Oxford, Cambridge, London, and Wales. I was a navigator sitting next to the driver. And we had radio contact between the buses, and we went right across Europe and through the Middle East. We did a little detour in the Middle East, and we did what couldn't possibly be done now. We drove to Baghdad and then on to Tehran, and then round to Pakistan, entering Pakistan at Nokkundi on the border, up to Lahore and into India. That's the good news, very successful. The sad news is about 7 days after we arrived in India, India and Pakistan went to war with each other. One of several wars, sadly, that they had over Kashmir. And that meant we had to make major changes to our arrangements. We stayed in India longer than we'd originally anticipated because we could not drive back the way we came. And we were all farmed out to Indian families. And I remember vividly, I spent 2 or 3 weeks with a family. He was a senior Indian civil servant, and his wife was Scottish from Edinburgh. That's why they had chosen them. So I had porridge for breakfast and curry for lunch. And it was a good cultural combination of that kind. So that introduced me in a very real sense, not just to young Indians, young Pakistanis, but to the Commonwealth as an institution and how it could inspire beyond the day-to-day political issues and other issues that we are always having to deal with. So first point I want to make, and it's something that will be well known to this audience, I'm sure, is the uniqueness of the Commonwealth. I mean, there are an infinite number of international organizations, some of which cover the whole world, like the United Nations or the World Health Organization or others like that. And there are others which are regional, the European Union, ASEAN, Mercosur in South America, and a number of groups of that kind, which reflect the needs of individual regions. What's unique about the Commonwealth? I don't know of any other organization of the same sophistication as the Commonwealth that transcends all these potential barriers. It's not universal. It's only 56 out of 180 countries, but they come from every region, every continent of the world, from all ethnic groups, from all cultures. They have certain things in common, mainly the historical associations that the Commonwealth has its origins in. But what they offer is an opportunity that there is the nearest parallel is Francophonie for the French-speaking countries of the world, and there's a much smaller Portuguese-speaking group that tries to form. But neither of these are anything like either the same scale or the same intensity or the same reputation. And you know when an organization is healthy, when countries are queuing up to join, as opposed to queuing up to leave. And just at the recent CHOGM in Kigali, 2 new countries, Togo and Gabon, they wanted to join and were admitted as member states. And following on with Mozambique and Rwanda, of course, it's now becoming a Commonwealth that does not necessarily have a connection with the old British Empire in historic terms. But they all have a strong link, either they have or wish to have, with the use of the English language as a medium of communication of a universal kind, and other connections of that kind. So it's a unique organization. Now, when we think back over the years, Commonwealth has never seen itself as in normal times, having a specific political opinion which all the member states are expected to adhere to. It's not that kind of organization, and it probably couldn't survive if it tried to be, because the disparity of political issues and so forth. There's many values that all the Commonwealth share, but when you come to specific policy initiatives in foreign policy and defense policy, security, economic, trade, it's unlikely the Commonwealth could ever be a single organ of political change by taking decisions and seeking to have them implemented. But I say that because there was one big exception. And the one big exception is when Sonny Ramphal was the Secretary General, it was about South Africa and apartheid. And when the Commonwealth unanimously expelled South Africa from the Commonwealth because of apartheid, and unanimously agreed there had to be sanctions. And all the member states agreed on refusing arms sales to South Africa. There was the sporting boycott, the Gleneagles Agreement, which excluded them from international sporting activities, and a whole range of other bans of that kind. But there was a difference of opinion on one issue, and that was economic sanctions. And I remember it very much because I was a minister, junior minister, in the Foreign Office at that time. I was Minister of State, and part of my remit under Sir Geoffrey Howe and Francis Pym, when they were foreign secretaries, part of my remit was sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, policy wasn't decided by a junior minister. That was the responsibility of the Prime Minister, Mrs. Thatcher, and the Foreign Secretary. But I was involved in some of these discussions. And I remember it caused great strains in the Commonwealth because the United Kingdom took the view that while it could support the whole spectrum of other sanctions, that economic sanctions would do more harm than good. I just make this point because I know there was a great deal of criticism of the United Kingdom position, but it wasn't, for 2 points I would make. First of all, some thought that Mrs. Thatcher may have had some private enthusiasm for apartheid, or at least willingness to support apartheid. I can tell you from the conversations I had with her that nothing could be further from the truth. She despised apartheid. She despised racial divisions of any kind, and that was not in any way relevant to her thinking. The other point worth just remembering from that period, because of the strains it caused in the Commonwealth, could have led potentially to some breakup, was that even in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, there were people with impeccable qualifications against apartheid who did not believe in economic sanctions. Alan Paton, for example, a well-known author of Cry the Beloved Country, Chief Gacha Buthelezi, and quite a number of other people I could name. They were a minority, I really acknowledge that, but it was a genuine debate as to what was the right way forward. In any event, that issue was resolved. And we see in an extraordinary way how Mandela and de Klerk, because it required both of them. It required that person receiving power and that person handing it over. And what was so heartening, I lived for 2 years in what was then Southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. I did my postgraduate research work on the politics of land in what is now Zimbabwe, the Land Apportionment Act. And living there and getting to know South Africa personally, like many people, I assumed that there would hardly ever be any chance of a peaceful transition. But that's what happened. And it happened in an extraordinary way because before the white South Africans had been defeated militarily by the ANC, they realized, and particularly it was de Klerk, realized that they had to find a peaceful way to achieve change. And of course, Mandela undoubtedly deserves the greatest credit for what happened. He was the monumental figure of the massive historic importance, but he needed a partner from the then white South African minority in order to get a peaceful transition. And it happened. And that is something which the Commonwealth then took enormous pleasure in accepting and welcoming back into the Commonwealth fold South Africa, but a totally new South Africa. And that is worth emphasizing. Now, let me go on to another matter, which is not often mentioned, but it's something which I attach importance to. You know, we're having at the moment an enormous crisis because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And as most of this audience will know, this is really, from the point of view of Mr. Putin, unfinished business. It's known that he long took the view that the collapse of the Soviet Union as a state was as dramatic as the end of communism or the end of the Cold War. And he doesn't care much about communism. And he was presumably pleased to see the end of the Cold War. But he believed and still believes that the collapse of what was called the Soviet Union, but was actually the Russian Empire that had been built up since Peter the Great over several hundred years, was a terrible mistake. And Ukraine as an independent country was the biggest mistake of all. Now, I mention this because part of the problem we're dealing with at the moment was the refusal, increasingly in recent years, dramatically in the case of Mr. Putin, to accept that the Russian Empire was part of history, which had come to an end when the Soviet Union collapsed. And it was the last European empire to disappear. It wasn't the only one, it was the last one. There'd been the British Empire, the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Belgian. All these empires had gone many years earlier, and I won't go into the reasons as to in each and every case. But the point I want to highlight today is the different way in which the United Kingdom approached the end of empire and the opposite extreme that we are seeing in Mr. Putin today. Because the United Kingdom, particularly in the case of India, it took some time. A lot of people needed persuading. Churchill was hardly persuaded even by the time it happened. But broadly speaking, the United Kingdom came to the conclusion after 1945 that the days of empire were gone and that the best way to end the empire was not to fight for the last person, but to actually accept it as something legitimate and historic and something to be welcomed for the future. So Britain, with all its many faults, and I'm not this evening going to go into the rights and wrongs of the empire. There will be other occasions when people can discuss these matters. There were lots of wrongs and there were some rights. But the point I'm wanting to emphasize is that it wasn't just unlike Russia. France had a much more traumatic experience with the end of its empire, both in Vietnam and in Algeria. In both cases, they fought wars to prevent these countries becoming truly independent. And they lost, and that had long-term consequences. Now, in the case of the United Kingdom, with varying degrees of enthusiasm, but with remarkable speed, the empire was transformed into what became the Commonwealth. And the old Commonwealth, before Indian independence, had assumed that to be in the Commonwealth, you had to have the Queen as your head of state. And the decision when India became independent that it wished to become a republic, that was the crucial watershed as to what kind of Commonwealth was going to emerge. And the decision was taken entirely with the agreement of the United Kingdom that it should not be necessary to have the Queen as head of state, but that countries could decide, each and every one of them, whether they wish to be a republic or remain as a monarchy. And most have become republics. A significant number still remain as monarchies, at least for the time being. So even if one assumes that there was a lot wrong with the empire, what is a historical extraordinary fact is that virtually every single country that was once part of the British Empire voluntarily and on its own initiative decided and wanted to retain its link with the United Kingdom and with the Queen as head of the Commonwealth and with all the other former parts of the British Empire. And that is clearly hard evidence that both in the United Kingdom, but also in all the countries of Africa or Canada, of Asia, there was a recognition that the period of empire had produced lasting consequences, some of which were positive and beneficial to all the countries. The joint use of English as a language of communication, but the rule of law as a principle of the vast majority of the Commonwealth countries, obviously the democratic system, operating in different ways, but nevertheless remaining fundamentally democratic, is true of most of the Commonwealth, and a range of other issues of that kind. They had enough in common that the historic links with the United Kingdom were not just swept away as something to be forgotten about as quickly as possible. And the extraordinary generosity of the rest of the Commonwealth in inviting Her Majesty the Queen to be head of the Commonwealth. It doesn't have executive role, but it did not necessarily have to follow that the head of state of the United Kingdom should be head of the Commonwealth. And the equally extraordinary recent generosity, the unanimous decision of the Commonwealth, that the Prince of Wales, when in due course he becomes monarch, he should succeed the Queen as head of the Commonwealth. That shows not just a generosity of spirit, which it does, but a belief that there is value in these sort of links continuing, not just during Her Majesty's reign, but indefinitely into the future for many, many years. And so I think that is something that all the Commonwealth countries can be proud of. They are showing an example to the rest of the world how the end of empire does not need to end up with the invasion that has happened in Ukraine. Just imagine if Mr. Putin had put out the hand of friendship to the Ukrainians and said, whatever our past differences, let's now work together jointly and in a friendly way. Then Ukraine wouldn't have had any interest in joining NATO. Ukraine might not necessarily want to be closer to the West than to Russia. Instead, they have been turned into enemies unnecessarily. And that is, of course, tragic. Now, I don't want to speak for too long because we're due to have time for questions and discussion. There are just two other points I would like to make in these remarks. You were good enough, Emeka, to mention my chairmanship of the inquiry into the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. And of course, one of the reasons why a decision taken by University of London, in good faith, but essentially for financial reasons, or a regional announcement, one of the reasons why that was far more controversial than they had anticipated was that the Institute of Commonwealth Studies is the only institute of its kind anywhere in the Commonwealth, a body specifically dedicated to the Commonwealth. And once the University of London realized, to put it mildly, they had stirred up quite a hornet's nest of a kind that they hadn't anticipated, they began to think about what they had been proposing and to accept that maybe second thoughts were required. And it was in that context that I was asked by the Vice Chancellor whether I'd be willing to be chair. And I said, well, I would be, but an absolute precondition had to be that they would, I didn't expect them to drop it right away, but they had to suspend the decision, the proposal to close the institute, because if my committee was going to be asked to make recommendations, we couldn't have excluded from that remit at least the possibility. It was up to the university whether they would accept our recommendations, but at least the possibility had to be there that the institute should have a future and a good future. I'm not going to go through all the details of the way we operated, but I will say the whole inquiry, I never thought this would be possible, was conducted by Zoom, what we're doing at the moment. All the taking of evidence from the witnesses, and that partly would have been necessary anyway to some degree because two of our witnesses lived in Australia, and therefore, obviously, that created an issue. One lived in Canada and one in the West Indies, in the Caribbean, and the rest were UK-based. But it was the actual then deliberation, taking evidence from someone on Zoom is not too difficult. You ask questions, they give answers, you can get a discussion going. But I'd assumed originally that the actual final deliberations of our committee, collectively, would have to be, at least for most of us, physically in London. And that turned out not to be possible. We hadn't yet finished the pandemic to a degree that would have permitted that. So we proceeded without that. And it actually was not as difficult as I had anticipated. And we were able to produce a report. Now, very briefly, of course, the most important thing about that report, accepted, all the recommendations were accepted by the university, is not only that the Institute continues, but it continues with an expanded role. And in the sense that, to a considerable degree, the Institute up till now has been looking not backwards, but looking at the history of the Commonwealth and analyzing what has been happening. And one of our recommendations is not to stop doing that, but that it must add to that a much greater direct involvement with the whole spectrum of other Commonwealth interests in looking at current issues, at looking at current challenges, and in working out ways in which recommendations could be processed as to ways in which the Commonwealth could, either collectively or individual parts of the Commonwealth, could achieve more than has been achieved until now. Now, once you start expanding an organization, far from saving money, you're obviously going to be spending more. And that has, of course, something the university had to consider. And so part of our recommendations, again, accepted by them, indeed very enthusiastically accepted by them, is that the Institute should do what so many organizations now do in the arts world, in cultural issues, in galleries, in theater, opera, look for private sponsorship of a philanthropic kind, not seeking to control what we do or what the Institute does, but to be prepared to assist with funding. And so one of the things that will be happening, it's already begun this process, is to judge what is the best way to raise the sort of sums required. Now, it shouldn't be beyond the wit of man to do that, because the actual budget of the Institute at the moment is somewhere between £2 and £3 million a year. To do all the things that we've recommended might push that budget up to 5 or 6 million. So we're not talking about raising hundreds of millions or anything of that kind. And if we can find even a modest number of either individuals or foundations, and there are a lot of them around, prepared to make this contribution. And what they wanted to know, quite properly, what they will want to know is the university going to continue providing the core funding? Because you can't expect people to provide private funds in order to remove any need for public funds as well. University has already made clear it's willing to do that, so that will not be an issue, and that is very much to be welcome. I think I noted that Sue Onslow is amongst the audience today, and I think we're all delighted that she's agreed to be the interim director of the Institute, filling in the gap until a permanent new director is appointed. She's already done a superb job to the benefit of the Commonwealth, and it's great that that is now benefiting the Institute specifically at this moment in time. The final comments on the as it were, more formal part of my remarks is when we look to the future of the Commonwealth, and there is going to be, I think, a very healthy future, we must never lose sight of the fact that the Commonwealth is not just Chogham, it's not just Marlborough House, it's not just the prime ministers and the presidents and so forth. There are over 100 Commonwealth organizations, and they cover a whole spectrum of issues and of policy areas. They cover culture, education, the arts, sport. We've got the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham just in a few weeks' time. And that is, as it were, the Commonwealth family. And so much of the connection with the Commonwealth that non-political people have is through these Commonwealth organizations, because of the profession they have, or because of their sporting activities, or because of their other interests. And we also have a huge new opportunity now, because if you think of the Commonwealth of Learning, you will all know the Commonwealth of Learning is involved in distance learning, using modern technology. Well, you know, in the last couple of years, thanks to the pandemic and what's now been discovered possible through Zoom, as we are doing today, distance learning, instead of benefiting 50,000 people around the Commonwealth, which is what the University of London has been doing in the recent past, in theory, you could multiply that to 100,000 to 200,000 at very little additional cost, because the technology you would use would be the same as is currently available, with obviously some modifications. So that provides a very important way in which tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of people in developing countries with limited educational opportunities at this moment in time can get the benefit through digital technology, through distance learning, using, of course, the Commonwealth Foundation, distance learning and other organizations of the Commonwealth, as well as other means of taking this forward. So somebody once remarked, the future is not what it used to be. I think for the Commonwealth, it will be a healthy future, as long as it is relevant to the people and to the interests of all the countries that make up the Commonwealth. And we're now something, what is it now? Something like 80 years the Commonwealth has existed. Who would have predicted in 1948 that almost a century later, the Commonwealth would be bigger, more member states, doing more, including all the Commonwealth organizations. Most of these have grown and developed. Not over that, they didn't begin 80 years ago. Most of them are much more recent and show that it's a vibrant organization which has still enormously important tasks to do. So thank you for this opportunity of allowing me to offer you these few thoughts and remarks.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Malcolm. I think you've given us a very broad-ranging, but also a very positive perspective to consider. And I'm going to throw this open to the audience. And Amitav Banerjee has led the way by putting his question in the chat. So he's at the head of the queue, and maybe others could do the same. Although I will look around and see if I can see hands raised as well. And what Amitav has said is, thank you, Sir Malcolm, for a very interesting lecture. and for your key role in extending the life of the ICS. My question is about the future of the Commonwealth itself. How debilitating do you think the recent divisive election for the Secretary Generalship will be for the Commonwealth? Do you think the divisions will heal and that the association can move forward effectively?
Well, it was sad that it happened. Maybe it had to happen. There's obviously different views on that. And of course, it showed pretty well a 50-50 division, a slight majority in favor of the current Secretary General continuing for 2 years. So it was sad that it happened. But, you know, the Commonwealth consists of, at that level, of the heads of government. They're all politicians. They're all used to that. Look at what's happening in the United Kingdom at the moment, the choice of a new prime minister. You know, it's sometimes things happen that cause differences of view, and people who like to present themselves as uniform and all with the same views suddenly are found to be not having feet of clay, but having the diversity that exists in every family in the land, every community in the land. You have diversity. So I would have thought Lady Scotland is tough enough. I'm sure she's tough enough to live with the disappointment that it was as narrow. But she will have 2 years. I think what I hope will happen is that we will spend these 2 years in a constructive way, identifying who our successor should be. And let me just make one point there. There have been some first-class Secretaries General. Emma Nyoku is an example of that. Sonny Rumphel is an example of that. But you know, there have also been a number who have been more administrators than public figures. And what I hope will happen is that the Secretary General of the Commonwealth, whoever it is, man or woman, whatever country they come from, will either already be a public figure who has taken on this new responsibility, or someone with the personality and the charisma to become a public figure known throughout the Commonwealth. Because although the Secretary General doesn't have power, whoever he or she does have is influence. And they can have an audience with any head of government. And if there is a problem, they can go to the President of South Africa, the Prime Minister of Australia, President of India, Prime Minister of India, or whoever it might be. And they will be seen and received. And if they are a strong personality in their own right, doesn't mean they'll always get their own way, but they'll get a much better hearing. And who knows what they might achieve. That's the way the world operates. And I'm saying, I could be saying about the Secretary General of the United Nations as well. Same principle applies. Some have been very, very proactive, global figures. Others have been hardly heard of, even at the end of their term of office. So I hope we go for the charismatic end of the spectrum, because I think the Commonwealth will benefit from that.
Thank you very much for that, Malcolm. I see Richard has his hand up, Richard Bourne. Richard, would you like to put your question? You need to unmute.
Thank you very much indeed, Sir Malcolm, and thank you also, Stuart, for inviting me. My question to Sir Malcolm is, in the light of his role in proposing a charter for the Commonwealth, which had some very strong words, strong sections about democracy and also human rights, what was his reaction when he learnt that Togo and Gabon had been invited, who, without a great deal of discussion within the wider Commonwealth community, and became new members of the Commonwealth at Kigali? What was his view?
Well, the Commonwealth sometimes operates magnificently, and sometimes it does things slightly oddly. And you mentioned my role with the Eminent Persons Group and the Charter, but you, I'm sure, will remember that at the Heads of Government meeting in Perth, when we presented the Eminent Persons Group, the Charter was one recommendation, a very important one, which was accepted, but there was an equally important one that they declined to accept, and it's never been implemented, and it still should be. We said there should be a commissioner on human rights, not somebody who would be able to interfere and all that sort of stuff, but if that commissioner became aware of a human rights issue in any Commonwealth member of state, then they should have the function of opening up a dialogue with that country to see if there was a diplomatic way, a peaceful way of trying to get them to not go down the abuse of human rights route. Now, you make a perfectly fair point. I'm a private citizen. I can I'm not a member of the government, so I can make my own personal views known. I think I have no objection to Togo and Gabon becoming members of the Commonwealth, but I think I would agree with what I think is your remark, that the Commonwealth, before it accepts a new member state, at the very least they should expect that member state to have certain basic acceptance, in not just in principle, but in reality, of the rule of law and of respect for human rights. And if they're starting off not having that, their membership should be deferred. I mean, that's what happens with the European Union. And that's what happens with NATO. They will not accept a country. Now, sometimes you can have countries that are members becoming less democratic, less respectful of the rule of law, like Hungary or Poland. But even then, pressure can be put upon them to modify their behavior. But I think it's a mistake to accept a country into the Commonwealth, given the Commonwealth Charter and what the Commonwealth stands for, that it has a pretty poor record. Now, maybe things are happening in Togo or Gabon that I'm not aware of. I don't claim any expertise in these two countries. But certainly, their past record has not been something which fill us with enthusiasm, if I can put it that way. Let us hope that their membership of the Commonwealth will give them additional reason to change the way they operate, if I can put it as mildly as I can.
Thank you. Well, the next question is from Arif Zaman. He says, where do you see the Commonwealth figuring in future visions of international engagement and collaboration post the leadership battle in the Conservative Party if the Conservatives secure another election victory?
Well, you know, we've often said the Commonwealth, you're asking about what's happening in the UK at the moment with the leadership election. You know, we often talk about the Commonwealth as being extraordinarily diverse and transcending all the boundaries of ethnicity and culture and so forth. Well, the United Kingdom is proving, and particularly the party I happen to belong to, is showing at this very moment an extraordinary common diversity. I mean, I had very little time for Mr. Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, but I have to acknowledge that he, as Prime Minister, we talk about it in Britain having the great offices of state, being Chancellor of the Exchequer, Foreign Secretary, Home Secretary. Well, for the last 2 or 3 years, we've had Chancellor of the Exchequer and a Home Secretary of Asian background. We have a Foreign Secretary at the moment who's a woman, not the first woman Foreign Secretary, but Liz Truss meets that criteria. And we have within the cabinet people from African background, as well as others from Asian background. And that's an extraordinary, diverse cabinet. And I'm, as a Brit, I'm proud that the United Kingdom is showing the lead, because I think there are very few other countries, either in Europe or elsewhere, that could claim such diversity. And we may very well be in the process of choosing our first Prime Minister with an Asian background, something that would have seemed inconceivable in the days of Mr. Enoch Powell and his predictions of what was going to happen in the United Kingdom as a result of a non-white community becoming larger and larger.
Thank you. And the next question comes from Madhuri Bose, who's in Kolkata. And she says, some Commonwealth small countries may go underwater in the not too distant future. So shouldn't the Commonwealth place a major focus on addressing the environmental challenge?
Yeah, I remember being in 10 Downing Street when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister. And this is many years ago now, of course. And she was entertaining the President of the Maldives. And in her speech, she said what presidents and prime ministers often say when they're having to make a speech to a visiting head of state. She said, Britain and the Maldives have a great deal in common. And we all applauded. And then everyone was waiting to hear exactly what it was that Britain and the Maldives had in common. And Mrs. Thatcher, thinking desperately on her feet, said, yes, we're both islands. And which the president of the Maldives said, yes, but ours are sinking. Something which obviously the United Kingdom has not had to face. I think the single most important thing I learned when I was on the Eminent Persons Group, and I should have known it already, was the number of micro-states in the Commonwealth and the proportion they are of the total, whether they are Pacific islands or Caribbean islands or some elsewhere. they form a very big chunk of the Commonwealth, and they have different interests and different needs and requirements to the big countries. And climate, therefore, can have a very, very powerful impact on them. One of the values of the Commonwealth is that if you're the leader of a micro-state, some tiny, tiny island in the Pacific or in the Caribbean, you have direct access through CHOGM and other ways to the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, to the Prime Minister of India, the President of South Africa, Prime Minister of Canada. You're with the big guys in Commonwealth terms in a way that you wouldn't be if the Commonwealth didn't exist. So that is why most of them are very keen on the Commonwealth. It's not the only reason, but it's a very significant reason.
Thank you. Malcolm, we don't have another question posted at the moment. I don't see a hand up. So I'm going to jump in and ask you a question myself. You were talking earlier, I think in reply to our first question, Amitabh Banerjee, talking about the selection of the Secretary General and the qualities required for a good Secretary General, and the sort of charismatic personality being important. But what do you make of one of the outcomes of this latest contest, which seems to be this new principle that there should be a regard given to rotation through the regions of the Commonwealth in the selection of the Secretary General. Wouldn't it be the case that if you were looking for the very best person, we should stick with the previous practice of taking the best individual chosen by heads of government, regardless of where they might come from?
Well, I think the single most important consideration, as you imply, should be the caliber of the candidate and the impact for the benefit of the Commonwealth that he or she would be likely to make. That has to be the most important. If you have 2 or 3 candidates and they're all broadly of similar caliber, then the principle of rotation is not unreasonable. That you don't. I remember we had exactly this issue when I was Defense Secretary in the United Kingdom, and the question was when I was having to recommend a Chief of the Defense Staff, and that meant they either had to come from the Army, the Navy, or the Royal Air Force. And for years it had been done in Buggin's turn. The Army did it for one, and the next time the Navy, and then the Royal Air Force. And we changed that. We said, no, that's not acceptable. We want the best person who's available to be Chief of the Defense Staff because of the seriousness of that job. So I think the same principle applies. But, and I repeat the point, if there's nobody outstanding, but several people broadly similar, then there's nothing wrong with rotation. It's a good, the part of the world that one might be talking about, whether it's the Caribbean or Africa or wherever it might be, Pacific. The Commonwealth means just that little bit more to that region if they've got the public spokesman, the public voice of the Commonwealth, at least for several years, coming from their own part of the world.
Thank you.
Mark's looking. Mark.
Yes, Mark Robinson, I can see. Do you want to put your question, Mark?
Yes, Malcolm, thank you for a wonderful address. Brilliant as always. I was at CHOGM, and the support, the forums, youth, people's business, and attendances were tremendous. But what worried me was the lack of some key heads of state. I don't think there was no head of state from Australia, no head of state from New Zealand, no head of state from India, Pakistan, or Sri Lanka, no head of state from South Africa, because I believe that Ramaphosa had a falling out with Kagame, perhaps over the issue of the Secretary General. I don't know. But and the next heads of government meeting, very excellent Prime Minister, welcoming us all in Samoa. But I would hate to feel that in Commonwealth that the key leaders are going to start thinking, well, we don't really need to go to this meeting. And I just wonder what we can do to reinforce the necessity of key leaders being there, because you're quite right. That is what draws other leaders to be there.
Yeah, yes. It's not a new problem, though I think it's probably getting a slightly bigger problem than it's been in the past. And ultimately, all presidents and prime ministers are incredibly busy people. To go to Kigali or to Samoa or wherever the conference might be being held takes up a reasonable, almost better part of a week, traveling both directions in the conference itself. So you will not succeed in getting as many as you would like, certainly from the larger countries, unless the agenda stimulates them, unless there is a reason why they wish to be there. And I think one of the challenges for whoever is Secretary General will always have a great, whoever is Secretary General is intimately involved in the program for Chogan, Secretary General and his or her staff. The prime ministers and presidents are so busy, including the British Prime Minister, that it's only one item in their red box. It's only one item that they're having to think about and take a decision on. So I think in the real world, we should hope that the Marlborough House, particularly the Secretary General, puts quite a lot of effort into not just creating an agenda, but identifying the kind of issues that heads of government would not wish to be absent from when the Commonwealth is deliberating. One final point, one has to be realistic. Because the Commonwealth does not have executive power, then some heads of government will say, well, what difference does it make whether I'm there or not? I've got more important things to do in my own country or in some other part of the world. So the Commonwealth's always going to have that particular problem. It's not an executive body, nor should it be. But that means the attraction to extremely busy prime ministers and presidents will always be tempered with the other pressures on their time. Not an entirely satisfactory answer, I appreciate that, but I think that if there is a way forward, it has to be primarily through the skill and attention of the Secretariat and the Secretary General, because they will have more ability to impact discussion on the agenda.
Very realistic answer, Malcolm. Thank you.
Right, I'm looking for, is there anybody else who would like to ask a question?
Malcolm, splendid presentation. I think what John meant, my nephew John, Patsy's son, meant in his comment to you was that his mother might have been spinning gently in her grave when Malcolm was talking about Margaret Thatcher and apartheid. But leaving that aside, I was fascinated by some of the parallels you drew and some of the differences you emphasized on the subjects of A, sanctions, and B, the disappearance of empires. And I wondered if you would risk a comment on the developing attitude of Commonwealth member and in the process of becoming the world's most populous nation, India, towards Russia in connection with Ukraine.
Yeah, I will make a comment on that. I mean, obviously, a lot of people have been disappointed that India did not, particularly as a democratic country and so forth, they did not feel able to join Britain, United States, other Western countries, democratic countries. But, you know, I wasn't entirely surprised. And not just about India, about a number of other countries. Because if you look back during the Cold War, there was a whole group of countries, mainly from the Third World. They actually called themselves the non-aligned movement. And they declined to take sides, as between the Soviet Union and the West, during the Cold War for that whole 30, 40-year period. Not because they didn't have opinions, but they said, well, you know, ultimately, we have to look to our own national perspectives and priorities. And as a non-aligned movement, we don't see why we should throw in our lot with either the Soviet Union or the West. Now, in the case of Russia, the case of India, I should say, there's an additional consideration, which we must be aware of, even if it may be disappointing from our point of view, that India's main concern has never been Russia, it's China. And because China and Pakistan have a very close relationship and have had for many years, India has chosen to be very willing to develop a comparable relationship with Russia. You know? And it's made a lot of sense from an Indian perspective to do that. Now, India has become more flexible recently because of the nature of the Chinese threat. India, without breaking its links with Russia, has now joined the United States, Japan, and South Korea in what is called the Quad, which are four, and Australia, I should have said. There's now 5 countries. And these are countries that are working together to try to discourage China from the rather aggressive foreign policy it's been pursuing in Asia at the expense of all of the neighbors. I mean, people often think of China as simply having a row with America or with Europe. Far from it. The most difficult problem in Asia, and where the Chinese government has taken some very foolish decisions, they've alienated every one of their Asian neighbors, from Japan through South Korea, Taiwan, Southeast Asian countries, and India, by using their military power or their demands of a diplomatic kind to claim territory that is not currently part of China, most notably in the South China Sea, potentially an invasion of Taiwan, and so forth. So India, having had such a border experience with China, lost 30 or 40 Indian soldiers who were killed just recently, relatively recently. India is working closely with the United States on that issue. So the whole position of India is perhaps more complex and complicated than one might otherwise realize. But ultimately, the Indians are trying to identify India's national interests, surprise, surprise, and give that priority.
Well, thank you. That's a very perceptive analysis. I agree with it, absolutely agree with it. But in terms of Commonwealth influence, it would be quite interesting if India changed its position on Ukraine even marginally.
Yes. I mean, the interesting point to bear in mind is that a substantial number of Commonwealth countries voted to condemn Russia in the General Assembly of the United Nations for their invasion of the Ukraine. Another substantial chunk abstained, and it's the ones who abstained that we've had most of the comment about. Virtually none of them actually voted with Russia, either in the Security Council or in the General Assembly. There's hardly a single Commonwealth country, and there may not have been any at all, I can't remember. Certainly if there were, there was only 1 or 2 small ones that actually voted with Russia to support what Russia was saying. So it was really a choice between condemning Russia or abstaining. And for the reasons I mentioned earlier, abstention has been, it's not novel to the Ukraine crisis, for many of the African, Asian, Latin American countries who prefer that option.
Many thanks.
Thank you, Malcolm. We just hit 6 o'clock, and I've got 3 questions still to be asked.
Short answer.
Are we all right? Can we press on?
Okay, if you are.
Yeah, fine. So the first one comes from Anthony Ellman. He says, once upon a day, the Commonwealth Secretariat had an agricultural division, which was closed down, reflecting the reduced priority then given by many international organizations to agriculture and food production, and allowing the food crisis that now faces the world to develop unchecked. How do you see this trend being countered?
Anthony, I'm sorry, I'm afraid I'm not familiar with the detail of what you've just been describing. It sounds a matter of real concern, because obviously for many countries around the world, particularly Commonwealth countries, agriculture and food production are fundamental to their national well-being, even more than they are to developed countries. So I'm concerned about it, but I'm afraid I just don't have an awareness of what happened on this particular occasion, where you say some decision was taken by the Commonwealth Secretariat. I'm sorry about that.
Let's turn to Peter now to put his question. Peter Williams.
I have 2 concerns which I would be interested in Sir Malcolm's responses to about the Commonwealth. One is, do you think we have some kind of a democratic deficit in the Commonwealth, in that there is no forum or assembly where the executive can be held to account? I mean, we don't have any, parliamentary select committees. We don't have an open assembly. I don't know how one could address that, whether through some kind of arrangement through the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, say, but in a way, it does seem to people who work with Commonwealth affairs that things are often done in a very secretive and rather unopen way, and the Secretary General is not sort of, that we don't really have forums where she can be questioned by politicians or others. The second question is a problem which I find in this professional sphere. I'm very active in Commonwealth education. One problem with democracy is that ministers change so much, and you go these days to a Commonwealth Ministers of Education meeting, and you're going to find that about 10% or 20% of the ministers were present at the one before. And this is the sort of continuity problem is going to gnaw at effective Commonwealth discussion. And I just wonder whether we can find ways to get a little bit more continuity and experience behind Commonwealth dialogues.
Well, if I can deal with your second question first, Peter. Yes, there is an alternative way of doing it. It's the Putin way. It's the way of being an authoritarian state. Xi Jinping is now coming up to his third term. And some people might think that's a very good idea because it provides continuity. You know who's going to be there. But of course, it is disastrous. There's no accountability of any kind. That's the whole point of authoritarian states. The public aren't consulted. Now, you can have people longer in ministerial office in democracies. I mean, Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, Tony Blair was Prime Minister in both cases for over 10 years because they kept winning elections, basically, and they kept the confidence of their supporters during that period of time. But at least once they stopped being user-friendly, there was a peaceful democratic way of getting rid of them. And that was very good. So I don't go along with the argument that there is some fundamental problem about how long ministers serve. I mean, you're quite right, prime ministers sometimes reshuffle their governments far too often and without any real attention given to giving a chance to a minister to have time to implement his policy or her policy. That needs time. Your minister, like any other job, you need at least 2 or 3 years to be able to do anything worth doing. So I go along with that, but the remedy is there by public pressure on a democratic prime minister, not to reshuffle simply for the sake of reshuffling. On your earlier question, I don't see any reason why the Secretary General of the Commonwealth should not voluntarily, doesn't need agreement from the heads of state, say I will be subject to a public session when either journalists or Commonwealth representatives or other people can cross-examine me on any matters relevant to the Commonwealth. And they should do that 3 or 4 times a year. They ought to have the skills to do that. Otherwise, they shouldn't be doing the job in the first place. Because Secretary General is like a Prime Minister answering questions in the House of Commons. That ultimately is the body they're accounted to. So, if you ask people in most Commonwealth countries who the Secretary General is at the moment, that if more than 1% would be able to give you the answer. That should not be the case.
Thank you, Malcolm. And the final question comes from Lorna McLaren, and she says, with the drastic cuts in the UK aid budget, do you think that Commonwealth countries will be turning away from the UK and looking to other major players such as Russia and China?
Well, you said that, I mean, the cuts were very heavy, and I'm not defending them, but they were heavy from a very, very large total. The UK aid budget was one of the largest in the world, and there was a ridiculous formula that as the GDP of the UK grew, the aid budget had to grow at the same rate. Now, we don't have that criteria for the National Health Service, or for education and schools, or the defence budget. In each and every case, the cabinet, the elected government decide, and Parliament has to approve the priorities the government wishes to recommend. And sometimes that means some departments get more than others, but they don't get locked into an automatic system. And although I'm a great supporter of overseas development, I thought that was a very stupid formula that successive governments had imposed upon themselves. And I was very delighted when they got rid of it. So sadly, one of the consequences because of the economic problems unleashed by the pandemic was that the aid budget was so big that it was deemed, and perhaps not wisely, but it was deemed possible to get significant savings from that direction. But what I would strongly defend is that any government needs the flexibility and should not be tying itself by statute to having to increase budgets by some artificial formula.
Thank you, Malcolm. I think that is now all the questions that we want to throw at you. And I just wanted to clarify that John Robertson, Patsy's son, is with us, but he has said that he's got COVID and is in bed and is therefore doesn't have his screen on, which is understandable in the circumstances. And he did just want to say that he wasn't actually pitching into opinions about Margaret Thatcher earlier on. He was just referring to that his mother, while she would probably be very proud of his involvement in the Commonwealth Games, might have been slightly sceptical as well. I think that's what he was saying.
Totally entitled to be. These are controversial matters.
Yes. I'm now going to call upon the Vice Chair of the Commonwealth Association, Vishal Mukherjee, to give a vote of thanks to Sir Malcolm.
Sir Malcolm, Chief Anyoko, Stuart, fellow members and invited guests. After Sir Malcolm's inspiring and thought-provoking lecture and the lively discussion that has followed, it is my privilege to propose a vote of thanks to our special guest, Sir Malcolm Rifkind. Sir Malcolm, as Chief Anyoko said in his introductory remarks, your interest and commitment to the Commonwealth has extended far beyond any particular governmental portfolio that you may have held over your long political career. And I think you've clarified to us from the time you were at Edinburgh University, went on this amazing tour of India, etc. And that commitment has been shown in a very practical and clear-headed way whenever your services have been sought. That is why we have listened to you with particular attention today, not least because all of us who are former staff of Commonwealth organizations care deeply about the Commonwealth and about its future. Thank you for speaking frankly and without losing the positivity that has shone through your remarks. You have been so generous with your valuable time, and we deeply appreciate the views that you have shared with us today. I think you have demonstrated why this annual memorial lecture is such a fitting tribute to our founder, friend, and colleague, Patsy Robertson. We would also like to express our gratitude to Patsy's family members who are present on this occasion and hope that they have enjoyed this lecture, even if, once again, we've been prevented from meeting in person. Now, if we were in Marlborough House, I would now call for a big round of applause for Sir Malcolm. Since we are on Zoom, now is the moment to indicate your approval with whatever electronic devices you may have to hand. Thank you, Sir Malcolm.
Thank you very, very much indeed. That's very generous.